So the time to peak does seem to be pretty stable. Although we were just having a conversation about this with some of the other coaches, and we have noticed that over a long period of time, like multiple years, there does seem to be a shortening that happens. Usually not a lot, usually a week, or one exposure. Sometimes two, when we've had outliers from that, but there might be an exposure or a shortening that happens on a long enough timeline. But in general, yeah, it's pretty stable. As long as the difficulty of the program is pretty consistent. Like if you really crank up the difficulty of your program, then you have recovery issues, so you peak early, but that's not even really a peak in terms of, I wouldn't think of that as like peak condition. That's your fatigue is just outpacing your ability to recover at that point. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. It's just that it's such a odd thing that averages out to be that way, where it doesn't. It's pretty much the same. Isn't that just one of those crazy things?
Well, I mean, yeah, it does. It seems weird, right? Like, you mean if I'm squatting high intensity, squatting low intensity, doing different exercises, high reps, low reps, and it's all about 6 exposures. Yeah. So if I think of it as adaptation to a stimulus, that you give your body stimulus A, and there's an adaptation process, and my body completes that process in roughly, not completes the process, but kind of starts to desensitize to that stimulus is, I think, maybe a more accurate way to think of it. Like spend some time in a loud factory and then you start to tune out the background noise. Like that kind of desensitization is what I'm talking about. I think you kind of stop acclimating to, or stop adapting to the training on a certain timeline, and that varies from person to person. When I think of it like that, it doesn't seem so weird, like if you change the pitch of the noise, change the volume of the noise, yeah, it's a different sound, but you still adapt to it, and you still desensitize to it, and it takes probably roughly the same amount of time.
You think intensity is the key factor there?
I think it has something to do with it, right? So this is something that I haven't quite figured out. I'd be curious to know what you guys think, actually. So we know that, so what counts as an exposure, right? There's this notion of counting the number of exposures to your time to peak. If I train the competition squat, that's one thing. And then if I do lunges, that's very clearly not a squat. It's the same muscles, but very different. But what about a safety bar squat? It's the same kind of pattern. Is that the same exposure? Or what about the difference between a competition bench and a touch and go bench? Like those are really close together. Does your body really respond completely different? Like as though those are completely different movements? I don't know. From my conversations with Derek and by extension Bondarchuk, he's telling me that they think that there's something to do with the intensity, and that the magic number seems to be something around 10%. That if movements are roughly 10% different, then they seem to register as different exposures. Now, it's important to note that there's not actually an exposure counter anywhere in your body that's like, oh, that's one squat, oh, that's 2 squats, but it's a heuristic. Does this roughly seem like it's matching up or not? And I can kind of see that. I know for myself, when I'm doing things like touch and go bench, it's usually for a lot higher reps. So there's a pretty significant intensity difference. But I would think, if you were to do, heavy single comp bench and then a heavy single touch and go bench, that those might actually be really close to the same thing, definitely within 10% of each other.
Well, and you've talked before about attractors and fluctuators.
Yeah.
A lot of the attractors within those movements are going to be very similar.
That's a good point.
You might have, like, let's use the touch and go bench and a competition bench. The attractors of elbow flare and range of motion and all those things are going to be so similar that now really velocity becomes probably the biggest fluctuator there. Same thing with like a safety bar squat. We still have to go to depth, and we can change foot width, we can change specialty bar type, we can change bar placement, but you still have those same attractors. I think that's kind of where that 10% comes from. Is, we still have a standard, especially in powerlifting. We still have such a standard to meet. There's a lot of other things you can change, but does your body really know the difference between a high bar wide stand squat versus a low bar comp squat, or the touch and go bench in a comp grip and an actual paused bench in a comp grip? And I think that's where, like, my head's been trying to wrap the same thing for a while now too. How much variation do you incorporate when you talk about a lunge? A lunge is not a squat. I still need to keep squats, obviously, but how far off from competition can we go and still get stimulus to bring it back around for that peak and still be in the right spot?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I hadn't actually tied it into the Bosch stuff. Attractors and fluctuators. Yeah.
And I'm thinking about just stress in general, where we're looking for, where you're like a safety bar squat and a low bar back squat are similar enough to be, does the body actually tell the difference? And that's when we're getting into the attractor states of movement patterns. But if we also let's just think of the stress of the tissue, I mean, what's actually eliciting some type of physiological adaptation? Is it mechanical stress? Is it percentage of motor neuron pool excitability? If we're talking about some type of like hypertrophy effect, where we're trying to get as much motor neuron activity as we can, activate the whole pool. Whereas maybe mechanical stress is, and that's where intensity lives, just put as much mechanical stress on the tissues. And perhaps the reason that a split squat isn't quite as good on average is maybe it just doesn't have as much mechanical tension. It's the pattern, even with the split squat, the pattern between that and a squat on that one side are relatively the same. Your knee is bending and your hip is bending. I don't know if the body's thinking this is a split squat versus a back squat from a tissue standpoint.
Well, forgive me for taking this back into the kind of a fuzzy area, but if you tie in the psychological aspects of it, the notions of intention, then go back to that being in that loud factory, right? And you're in there for a while and you tune out the background noise. But if somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, do you hear that?" Then you listen. Now you hear it again. That maybe the fact that you walk up to it and you say, "That is a safety squat bar." Psychologically now your approach to it, the way it feels is different. The way that like your environment is different. That's Bosch talks about like the different kinds of variation. I'm sure I'm messing that term up, but he's got different levels, and environment would be one of them that tends to be pretty not utilized, I think, for a lot of gym rats, but like you go to a different gym, a different setting, you train on a different rack than you normally train at, it feels a little bit different. The quality of attention that you're paying to that session is just a little bit different, and maybe that's enough in terms of stimulating an adaptation.
Well, that's kind of one of the premise of emerging strategies is you take advantage of variation and you don't worry too much about specificity, which actually segues into a conversation I wanted to have with you anyway, which is transference versus specificity.
Sure.
But if you if you respect that you need somewhat of a similar stimulus to progress a particular stimulus, but then be okay changing the stimulus without necessarily overthinking whether this is the right exercise for the particular goal, but it's close enough, and the big key factor is that it's different enough. You've changed something. Now, maybe in the scenario that you just discussed, maybe you can just do the same exercise, but if you went to a different gym every day that you did the same exercise, maybe that would be enough variation in the training, you know? Yeah. But because people usually go to the same gym and they use a similar rack and they're around similar people, then we switch up the exercises, and that's the varied stimulus or something like that. But part of the thing with, I think, people pushing away from emergent strategies are saying, oh, that's different, is the variation of it, and saying, well, we need to taper into specificity as we get closer to competition, because specificity is king, and in order to get good at the thing, we have to do more of the thing. So if it's powerlifting, we have to do heavier 1 rep max squats. We got to get used to that.